أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه وخاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيد الأولين والآخرين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين اللهم صل على ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. Jazakallah for the humble honor that I can recite and together we can learn about our dear Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli. So when I was reading the timetable, as of course it's very nice to see familiar faces at Mahfil Ali, you put in there question and answer session. So I was thinking at least you can give the lecture a break on Milad and Nabi, but unfortunately no such thing is going to happen. So I had to prepare doubly hard, unfortunately. Salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala. In deciding what topic to think about, for me at least, and inshallah for all of us, akhlaq is a word often associated with our dear Prophet. And we often say that this is arguably his greatest legacy. Indeed, this was his mission, for he was there to perfect people's morals, makarimul akhlaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in describing our Prophet, he says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Innaka la'ala khuluqin azim in Suratul Qalam. Indeed, you have a mighty disposition, or you have a mighty character. Now, we have known this since childhood, and we continue to teach this as the fundamental part of the Prophet's legacy. My humble question is this, that today in the 21st century, when there are always going to be evolving trends, whichever century that we live in, how do we know that we are implementing the akhlaq or morals of the Prophet in our character? I know that might seem like a simple question, but our identities are changing all the time due to different trends, whether it's celebrity culture or corporatism or modernity and all these different trends, they affect our identity at times without us realizing it. So now, whenever we mention akhlaq and we mention this beauty of the Prophet, as akhlaq is equated with ihsan, with something absolutely beautiful, how do we situate and contextualize the Prophet's conduct and his mission within some of the trends that we are experiencing today? The hardest task, at least this is whenever I would like to analyze any holy figure, maybe I feel it is not done enough, but whenever we mention any great saint, the hardest thing is to contextualize that saint or to appropriately position him for our needs and for what we are going through. As you know, during Muharram I talked about the madrasa system and how I humbly felt that Imam Ali was relevant to that through letter 31. Now, to do or to make these links, in my view, is very difficult because we're trying to look back in history and go into the mind of the Prophet. And this is what I want to attempt to do, because I feel there's no other option, personally. I would like to know when he was setting his sunnah or performing these habits, did he know that this sunnah would reach millions and billions of people, for example? Did he know that? What was his intention in doing that? Did he know that his akhlaq would be a source of liberation for people? What was his intention there? Because once we're able to extract all of that, then we can say how the Prophet is specifically relevant for our daily needs and for what we are going through, not just as Muslims, but as human beings. I want to focus on one trend, which is called managerialism. Okay, and you may have heard of it. But there has been research done over the last 10, 20 years, especially by one professor who I'm in touch with, Professor Richard Roberts, is a very lovely guy. And he has written several books and articles on this. And the reason that I'm mentioning this to you is because I think it's a trend which we're all experiencing in our workplace, in most professions, and even our community environment. Let me first of all explain this, and then I'll situate our dear Prophet within this trend. Salawat. Now, managerialism is basically the imposition of human resource management in a corporate and business environment in order to control and manage somebody's soul and identity. That's what it is. By human resources, we mean the following. We mean recruitment and selection. We mean interview technique. We mean training and development, strategy, corporate goals, and planning. Now, these are words which we often associate ourselves with, whether it's a building project, whether it's involving ourselves in a conference, organizing a conference, whether it's doing training or teachers training, all of these things use these common words. And these words, which may be very familiar to you and may be harmless to you, have a particular view and agenda, which is that by using human beings as a resource, literally, that's what it means, human resource. And I'm not saying anything against anybody that is in human resources. I'm trying to take a very objective view. That we are simply resources for companies and firms and businesses for what is known as the society machine. Why? Because a human being is there to produce efficiency. We are there to make sure that society fulfills its next goals, that this firm or company reaches its next target, and you, when you read in the website, you are part of this beautiful global corporate vision, and you are within this multi-global team. And yes, you are, because once you contribute in that team, you are one of the alliance members of that firm or company. I'm just paraphrasing from the many, many websites and recruitment processes that I've gone through. So you are a resource, because you are a resource for the goals of that company and firm. And through these techniques, what happens? The company or firm is able to identify what kind of identity you have in order to control that identity, so that you and I can be used to fulfill a part of the production process. So if you notice, and as we all do this, we put on our CV, I'm great at teamwork, I'm great at communication, I'm really not a loner, I'm such a sociable person, right? We put all these things. And what's the end game of that? Because if you're able to put all that, then when you go for the particular psychometric tests and assessment schedules, one of the tests, which is now very common, is that you have a personality test, right? So what do you do if there is a conflict in a team? What do you do, for example, if you conflict with your manager? And God forbid that you actually give the wrong answer, and this is my humble experience, you won't get the job, right? So you have to make sure that, no, I will placate this person and that person and that person, and I'll have the company's objective in mind, etc., etc., and I will be involved in the planning. And all of this is to identify which people, and this is the crux here, which people have an identity who their identity can be controlled or not. So if you're able to project your own set of values against the firm's values, then you may not be selected. But if your identity is malleable and changeable and can be manipulated as a resource, then you are going to be selected. Now, what I'm saying is nothing new, and in my view, nothing controversial at all. There is tons of research on this, and you may refer to a book called Religion, Theology, and the Human Sciences by Richard Roberts, which explains all this. And even as I explained in Muharram, universities are now subject to this as well. So for example, if there's not enough intake for a module, it's not going to run, because the module is there for the efficiency of a university, so that the module is there to give the university profit, not teaching or learning. That's why you have new modules every year, okay? So this has seeped into our culture. Even if you look at the community environment, the way that we organize a conference or run a teacher's training workshop or a leadership program is based on this. is based on the ideology that we are resources for the community. But of course, we don't have any models of our own. As I said, even in terms of our madrasa, we don't have any models that we can run our teachers' training workshops. We don't have it. So instead, we will use these particular techniques to tell people you are a resource for the community, but your identity must be this. Now, all of this is there to make sure that your akhlaq is controlled by the actions and the morals and the values of that particular company or firm. And that is why you find that something strange happens to you, and especially those who are in the corporate environment, maybe they can testify, at least in my experience as well. What happens is you are molded to develop what is known as performance absolute. So you are meant to be the greatest human asset and resource for that company and firm. And of course, in 5-10 years, you'll be rewarded with whatever salary rise and position, etc. However, this directly conflicts with something that we are taught since we are a child. We are taught that we are to submit to none other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is our performance absolute. Now, if a company or firm's values coincides with the Asma al-Husna, the beautiful akhlaq, the beautiful attributes of the Almighty, there is no problem. But in my humble view, that's very few and far between in a secular environment. Very few and far between. So then the person's life is contradicted, and that's why you find lots of people asking Maraja the same sort of question. You go to any office of any Maraja, you'll see very similar questions. And they will ask alims the same question. What do I do in this company when my value conflicts with this value? When we go out for dinner, when I want to shake hands, whatever it is, when I'm interacting with my manager and colleagues. Because you are put in a particular predicament. As such, this concept of managerialism actually makes a person less transcendental, with less of a purpose, because the person's whole cosmos and existence is to make sure that I am a resource within that particular business and corporate and managed environment. And that is why we always struggle, and especially young people today, we always try to find the time. I want to give my time to the community, I want to give my time to work, etc., etc. And sometimes it's a very defeatist attitude. How do we get a work-life balance in our lives? That's the eternal question. And I want to examine how the Prophet did this, and this is where he is relevant. Salawat, please. I hope I've explained that clearly. Is that okay? And maybe some of you disagree, but I'm also sharing my experiences as well, as I've gone through all these processes, and some of you may also agree as well. Now you may say, well, how on earth is our dear Prophet relevant to this whole situation? In the Prophet's time, in our dear Prophet's time, the Meccan elite were a very commercialist or very commercial-minded particular clan or clergy. We know that the Kaaba was used as the central commercial place, and they nurtured a commercial attitude in people, from the Bedouin Arab to the person higher than that, to make sure that now the time that the Meccan or all the caravans come into Mecca, this is a time where you make money. This is a time where your goals and your values and your akhlaq are there for self-interest and are there for luxury. And as a result, the orphans and the wayfarers and the needy were left on the street. So now what was happening, and what our dear Prophet saw as a young man, and this is why he is known as Al-Amin, as a trustworthy person, is because in his dealings, in any of his dealings, he made sure that any of his commercial or business dealings was done with honesty, not to shortchange anybody, and done with an attitude to safeguard and look after other people, not for commercial self-interest as such. So, people like Abu Sufyan and the rest of the Meccan elite were there to nurture people, to make sure that their mentality about the Kaaba, the sanctified sanctuary known in the Quran as Bakka, and that sanctified sanctuary from the time of Ibrahim was no longer a holy sanctuary as such, but was a means by which somebody can actually gain a greater place on the earth, with no conception of transcendence, with no conception of taqwa, of God consciousness. And this was the challenge which our Prophet had. Now, how did he actually match this? This is where we can find a direct parallel. We can look at the Prophet's sunnah in a couple of ways. And by sunnah, I mean tradition or trodden path. We can say that the sunnah means all of the hadith compilations, post-ghaiba compilations which we have, which tells us what the actions of the Prophets were. And this is what we say. Our Kutubul Arba of the books by Saduq and Tusi and others, that these books tell us the actions and deeds of the Prophet and A'immah. So now we say sunnah, we always say this is the classical definition. We say sunnah is aqwal, statements, or af'al, actions, or taqreer, tacit approval of the Prophet, and especially for Shia Muslims, the Imams. So this is how we define sunnah. We categorize sunnah as these three things, and these three things have been transmitted over time in our compilations. This is the standard way that we are taught, whether in the Hawza or whether in Madrasa. What is another way to look at the concept of the sunnah? And this also directly stems from some of the ahadith I'm going to quote to you. Did the Prophet know what he was doing when he was initiating these new habits? These were new habits, by the way. It was very different to play with children. It's very different to eat with a slave. It's very different to encourage a woman, for example, in her own freedoms as much as he could in the society. This is a new habit forming in the society. One way to look at it is a psychological way. What he was trying to do when he was initiating these new habits, if you imagine that the Prophet was relevant to the Bedouin Arab or to the intellectual person or to somebody searching for him like Salman Farsi, how on earth did the Prophet relate to all of these categories of people? For in both Shia and Sunni narrations, there's a very famous narration, the Prophets are commanded to speak to people in accordance with their intellects. Myself, I have a hard time trying to condense information to you, or if you are a madrasa teacher, if you are reading, if you are at any workplace or any, where you have to communicate things, you know how hard it is to appeal to every person. Because I know you're all going to ask me questions as well, okay? And some of you will ask 3 questions, some of you ask 1 question, because all of you are used to different intellectual levels. Now, we have to get into the mind of the Prophet. This is a tough question. In my humble view, and I'll read the narration in a minute, what he was trying to do was, if he was moving, and I literally mean his body here, if he was eating with a slave and he eats with his right hand, okay, or he's actually sitting with a slave and everybody's seeing it, or he's sitting with a Bedouin Arab and he's giving him food, don't we think that the repetitive nature of that habit will be seen and implemented by every person in society, whatever commercial background that person has, so that that person will go and tell his or her Bedouin Arab or fellow neighbor, this is now what I have learnt, and it resonates with my soul. And I like this man, because the Prophet was a likable, amiable person. He was a lovely, affectionate person. He says, I like this man and I want to sit with him again. Subhanallah. I want to sit with him again. And just because either I want to learn from him or just because I like his company. So the Prophet is very clever. And that doesn't mean that he's not genuine. Of course, he likes to do these things. He's genuine in his conduct. But he's very aware that what he is doing is going to be picked up by those around him. As any parent or elder brother knows that whatever you do will be copied by a younger brother or the son or the daughter, etc. So when he starts eating with his right hand or shares his food, then this habit becomes copied all the time. And not only that, at a higher level, when he's teaching something about the Quran to his companions, now that can only be known by his few companions. like Ali ibn Abi Talib or Bilal or Salman Farsi or these great companions of his, then that will be transmitted at a very intellectual level. And that will be communicated at a specific level. But the cleverness of the Sunnah of the Prophet is not in the compilations, or if you like, how we look at the deeds, but in the psychology of the way he looked at how habits can be repetitive, can transform an individual, and that habit will be picked up in the consciousness of that individual. Forget compilations. Look, when we are children, we are not learned. So where do we pick up our habits from? Where did our parents get our habits from? Because they picked up the Sunnah of our dear Prophet, which has been just simply picked up psychologically as much as it can by generations after generations. That's the cleverness and that's the beauty and the far-sightedness of the akhlaq of our dear Prophet. Salawat, please. Now, if we can appreciate this, it means akhlaq for the Prophet was a form of liberation. That's what akhlaq was. He liberated people from systems in society. Because today, if we say, what's wrong with the world, right? We have Bahrain, or we have human rights issues, which we discussed in Muharram. And we have so many issues. British Muslim identity, building the right mosque. And of course, we pray for the Salam Center. Inshallah, it is a success. Whatever issues it is, poor people in London, whatever it is. We hold a conference. And we put a YouTube video. Or we do a 50-page report. This is our way of solving things. This thing that we do of producing words all the time is a product of managerialism. Because as I gave the example, when you put in your CV that I'm good at teamwork and I'm good at networking, it's there so that that business or company or whatever institution is able to manipulate your words or use words in order to get across their own particular thinking or idea. I'm not saying that everything is negative. I'm not saying that all conferences are negative. But our mentality is to talk, and especially in an informatized age where we use websites, where the appearance of words gives the appearance of actions, or words gives the appearance of actions. How do I know whether King's College London or any university, Harvard University, whatever university, how do I know, really? How do I know whether that work which they're saying is going on? It's only if you come into any university and you sit in the class, then you can see what teaching goes on. But when you say that we are the best teaching institute and all these things, well, you have to feel it and see it. And you have to feel the actions. One of the things, again, which a lot of scholars are saying is, are human beings being duped by language and words today? That's another discussion in itself, but I'm giving you that side note as to whether institutions and communities and human beings are producing work. This is one thing. We often hear about it. In the newspaper, I gave the example of Bahrain last time, that yes, you'll have lots of Human Rights Watch producing documents. But the action on the ground and who is doing work and what money is reaching, this is the question which you read every other day on those websites or those newspapers which wish to challenge the status quo or wish to challenge institutionalized reports. So you have, now what's happening especially is that you have university journals and then you have rogue journals as well. So you have university journals, with a lot of funding and will give you information about all sorts of things. Then you have rogue journals which are not recognized, which will tell you things which make you feel uncomfortable about education or about many other things. And that's what's happening because people have realized that the internet can be used in so many different ways. And therefore, the greatest concern to us is if we want to work and do a good project, how are we going to implement it? How do we know that we are helping people? This is the thing. And I questioned myself when I talked about the madrasa vision, which you all gave your good feedback on. Am I just talking? Are we just talking? What now practical methods can we do? And when we talk to our community elders before internet revolution and how they worked in the community, and you sit down with elders, they give you very different stories about how they solve problems in the community. And that's something for us, and especially for young people, to learn from. So we can't say that everything which necessarily our elders did is old or archaic. So again, this is another dichotomy that we are faced with. In my view, the akhlaq was a liberation. Why? Because our dear Prophet personified beauty in his whole conduct. If people weren't going to give him money, if people were not going to give him respect, if people were going to throw him out of Makkah, which they did, what is the Prophet's strategy? What is the Prophet's strategy? The Prophet's strategy, and this is why he's a great Prophet, is that he personifies all of these beautiful habits in himself and liberates people by giving them a question. Does your conscience feel right? What are you going to do when you see an orphan on the street? What are you going to do when you see that idol? Will you break it? And will you break that idol in your nafs? That's the cleverness of the Prophet. So he used akhlaq as a source of liberation because he had nothing. He had a few companions who supported him and that was it. But because he was able to tap into the God consciousness of people through akhlaq, that's how he changed society. Whatever words we do, whatever conferences we hold, whatever management, whatever training we do, it's 5-10% really of what our actions can accomplish. And maybe that is the greatest lesson which the Prophet gives us. Salawat. And I want to give just a few examples just to show this. And by the majority of hadith, I've specifically used Amalia Tusi, Amalia of Suduk, Uyun al-Akhbar Rida al-Khisal. Those are my basic sources. I've tried to get as early sources and as authentic a hadith as possible. This hadith is from the 8th Imam. Okay, and this is what he says, which the Prophet said. Our Prophet said, there are 5 things that I will never leave until my death. Eating on the ground with slaves, riding on an unsaddled mount, milking the goat with my hands, my own hands, wearing coarse woolen clothing, and greeting the children, so that these actions may become a sunnah after me. He was very conscious of what he was doing. So these actions may become a sunnah after me. And you look at these actions and you think to yourself, what an ordinary man the Prophet is. Ordinary. He's doing work himself. He doesn't think he's grand in any way. He's milking the goat himself. He is greeting or playing with the children. He does not think himself of as an aloof person. And the further proof of that is his humility. It is reported that when he used to come into a gathering, he used to sit at the nearest place, not wanting any place. Not wanting any place. Now this is the Prophet, and he does not wish to have any self-aggrandized place in the gathering. And this is again something that scholars, that professionals, that leaders, that we all have to learn from. And not only that, he never liked people standing up for him, but when he did stand for others, then others would stand as well as a mark of respect for him. And when he used to like something, that means if he used to see a good deed in the community or in fellow human beings, he used to say, Alhamdulillahi alladhi bini'ammatihi tatimma as-salihat. Praise be to God, who with his blessing completes good deeds. How was the Prophet God conscious? How was the Prophet? What was his mind? He saw the grace of Allah in every single action. So if he were here today, and we always miss his presence, as we are missing him today, if he was here and he saw a good action, he would say this, praise be to God. With his bounty, he is able to complete these good deeds. That means our good deeds are not just of our doing. They're completed with the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And not only that, a good deed stands on its own. It should not be corrupted. You might initiate wrongdoings to me. I might do wrongdoings to you. But it does not mean I reject you. Your good deed is a shining jewel in front of my eyes. if we are to follow the Prophet. And Imam Ali said that the nafs is a johar, it is a jewel. It is this beautiful kind of diamond that we have. And therefore, today when we have any disagreement within the community, whether it's among scholars, whether somebody has given a different opinion, and this always plagues us, whether it's Muslims or non-Muslims, we often reject that person because either he is different or she is different, has a different opinion or does something differently. But the Prophet would praise the good deed of that individual and nurture that and acknowledge God's grace within that community. That's what makes the Prophet, nothing else. It's that insight. And when the Prophet in Imam Ali often says, I see God with the eyes of my heart or my heart, that's how it is. We can add other mystical things afterwards, there's no problem. But that is how. Because he is looking at people and all he is seeing is ni'mah. All he is seeing is blessing. All he is seeing is grace. He's seeing nothing else. And if every person, everything, every single aspect of creation is a reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can we not imagine what the Prophet saw in his vision? When we talk about Mi'raj and we talk about his spiritual stations, even Allama Tabatabai quotes this hadith in Kernel of the Kernel, and the Prophet is quoted as having saying that the children of Adam would see what I see, were it not for their loquaciousness, were it not for their chatter, were it not for our vain behavior. We would see that. And I'm trying to give as much as I can the mind and the heart of the Prophet in how he looked at things, so we can follow this great man's footsteps. Salawat. I want to end on a way that we can do this and link this back to managerialism. I pose the question that, or the idea that managerialism controls our identity. If you agree with it, you may disagree. But these processes that we have in the 21st century actually inhibit us, actually stop us from having a transcendental purpose. We are focused so much within our constant day-to-day activity that it's very difficult for us to break free and start to impose our own transcendental goals for our lives. And we have this kind of idea, of course, that when I retire, I will do something. I mean, this sometimes goes on. Maybe in young people's mind is changing, I don't know. But I will do this thing when I retire. And again, this is part of the managerialism process, so that you work for us for a long time. Yes? So essentially, that mentality then stops the identity from developing. So we don't know how to construct our identity. And I think that's the confidence and the vision that we would like. We would like to change this process. I mean, at least I would. I don't want to be stopped by any university or institution or any business environment, but that I cannot teach this or do this, for example, because you're stopping me express my values and my identity. And it is very difficult, especially if I give my own example, that in the university environment to say peace be upon him, and to say these things, and to talk about holy figures, to say let's study Muhammad, let's study Ali ibn Abi Talib. We can't study that, because essentially these figures are of a relegated past. And what we need to study is what is here in the now. So that is again another theory of managerialism. The here and the now must be studied all the time. And if the figures are relevant to the here and now, then you study them. If scholars are writing textbooks on Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, then you study that, because the efficiency is there. But who cares anyway about our first Imam in the university? That's the real question. That's the question to be asked. Although, of course, I don't believe that, but that's what you're faced with. So in order to break that mentality, you need a different kind of liberation and system. The confidence which the Prophet gives is through this hadith. And the hadith tells us, and I will recite it just now, the hadith tells us that when we look at any spiritual and moral action, we look at it as a form of constructing our godly identity. And that we look at it as receiving the blessing of the Almighty, and that when we look at anything, forgiveness and tawbah, this is not negative actions. Because when we do istighfar, of course we feel negative, I've done a bad deed. Look how the Prophet looks at this. He says, Man u'tiya arba'an lam yuhram arba'an. One who is given 4 things will not be prohibited from obtaining another 4 things. And what are these 4 things? Man u'tiya al-istighfara lam yuhram al-maghfira. One who is given the seeking of forgiveness will not be denied maghfirah, will not be denied pardon, will not be denied pardon. Man u'tiya shukra lam yuhram ziyada. One who is given thankfulness will not be denied increase. Man u'tiya tawba lam yuhram qabul. One who is given tawbah, okay, one who is given that sense of repentance will not be denied acceptance. And finally, man u'tiya du'a, one who is given supplication, lam yuhram al-ijaba, will not be denied a response or answer. When we raise our hands in dua, we are already given an answer. When we initiate tawbah, we are already given that sense of being pardoned. When we say thank you to Allah, shukran lillah, Allah increases our bounties. We take 1 step to Allah, Allah takes 2 steps or 10 steps to us. This is how the Prophet saw God. This is how he saw spiritual and moral actions. He says, if you are engaging in these actions, feel positive. And when you are feeling positive, you are now building your godly identity. And I mean, I only read this hadith in the last 4 to 5 days. There's so many hadith about the Prophet. But it made me reflect about how I should approach my own actions. That now actually, what should I think about when I do these things? And what is my purpose? My purpose is to not just receive the blessing of God, but to receive that opportunity of feeling close to Allah, of feeling pardoned, of seeing Allah's grace in my life. And then I can say, like the Prophet said, "O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, surely it is because of you and because of your bounty that you have completed this good deed in that person." Salawat. May Allah bless Muhammad on this day. May Allah bless his family. I really pray to Allah that we can learn from him, and may we follow in his footsteps, and may he forgive our sins on this day. May he forgive all of our mu'minin and marhumin sins. May he reduce the injustices in the world and help us bear our distresses with patience, inshallah. Surah Al-Fatiha.
Thank you, Imranali, for that inspiring talk. We'll now open the floor to questions and answers. We'll start with the ladies if they have any questions.
Assalamu alaikum. I just had a question. Were you saying that the managerialism is actually stopping us from being... I mean, I'm not sure if I understood you completely well, but I was going to say I disagree that I think it's actually ourselves who we get used to doing what society does rather than... I don't think you can actually blame it on the system. The system is just a natural social phenomena that human beings have, is to follow the norm, but it's actually ourselves who decide not to, to think about things and just follow them on.
No, Jazakallah for the question. No, I would agree with you. But my point in addition to that was when I gave the example of the CV and we put teamwork and these things. That's, in my view, and at least in my experience, that's very deliberate. Because I have not known, and you may correct me, but I have not known anybody to get a job without putting those values. And I also know that in the personality test, those values are analyzed and questioned, which means there is an imposition for you to behave in a way. So I agree with you, of course, the buck stops with us. But I believe the imposition is with that. They create that environment for you to conform to that, and you get used to it unless you are a very strong person. And then you kind of manage your life in a particular way and all that sort of thing. But in my view, I still feel there is that element of imposition there through these values.
Do the brothers have any questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Sheikh. I'm trying to balance out in my mind two conflicting views. How much, well, talking about the akhlaq, how much is Prophet's own effort towards building up his own akhlaq? Because when Allah chooses a person as a prophet or a rasul or an imam, Allah is not going to make a mistake that that person turns out to be of a bad akhlaq. So at every time or every level, Allah is going to guide that person in every respect, so that that person becomes the example for the ummah. So when we talk about, because imams and prophets all had their own akhlaqs, and here we say that the last prophet was of the highest akhlaq. So my basic question is that if it had not been Allah who had been guiding him continuously, then would he have himself been of that level of akhlaq, or how much was it his own effort? And then we can sort of bring it down to our level as to for that matter.
Okay. Jazakallah. No, I think that the indications that we are getting from the Quran and Sunnah is that, of course, the Prophet is a human being going through suffering, going through difficulties, and that is a clear indication of effort on his part to get through these sufferings, or for him, to say Alhamdulillah alladhi bi ni'amatihi and all that. That actually it is his decision to actually say, I like something and I'm going to invoke this. So there it is his own effort to appreciate. But it appears within the cosmos or design of the universe that these salihat, these good deeds, cannot be completed without God's grace. That is a kind of principle that we have, especially within Shia theology, when we look at the Imams as well, that they are kind of lutf from God as a further grace after prophets. But even generally within Muslim tradition, the idea of lutf and grace is part of the divine order. So for me, I don't look at it as a conflict. And I don't know what percentage you can say, but I would say both very, very openly. I would say it is his effort, and that attracts the grace of Allah, and in turn that grace also propels him for further things. And that is why Allah is Rahman and Rahim. So I look at it as a kind of cycle, or as a back and forth. I try, or we try, Allah shows even more affection. And we build on that affection. And if we don't try, then we're not grasping or getting that opportunity of lutf. That's the way I understand it personally. I don't know.
Any sisters? I have a question. Yes. Do you think that there is a need to differentiate what the Prophet did as a prophet and what the Prophet did as an individual? And is there any way of differentiating if that is what we should be doing? So should we, carry a stick if the Prophet carried a stick, or, dress in a certain way because the Prophet dressed in a certain way, or anything else for that matter? I mean, how would we differentiate between what the Prophet did as a prophet and as a guide for us, and what he did as an individual with his own kind of personality and his own characteristics and traits and things that were kind of unique to him, as there are to any individual?
No, Jazakallah. I think as an individual, obviously there are personal things associated with his sunnah, no doubt, like liking of honey and dates and these sort of things. But I think that the differentiation comes, in my view, a few ways. And this is the way I think some of the scholars have done it. One is if there is a textual indication, and we do have that, like from the sixth Imam, and Marhum Ayatollah Fadl has quoted this hadith in his book World of Our Youth. I remember he said that, dress in accordance with the people of your time. When there are textual indications that there is a freedom to divert from the sunnah, then I think there is no problem there. It's a very easy answer. Number two, I think that as information and as the world evolves and we get information about food or about certain practices, or if the dress is going to cause a problem, then obviously, as you know, issues of necessities and ihtiyat and these sort of things come in. So I think that we are tackling that. And I think we do make that differentiation as and when the time comes. I don't think we make it from the outset, however, where we kind of say, right, Prophet is a statesman, Prophet as an individual, Prophet. I don't think we say, right, he's actually like Sahifatul Medina, Charter of Medina. We don't say the Prophet is a human rights activist or a human rights leader. We sort of put everything in one. Where I do believe there is a merit in separating things so we can learn from him. So I don't think there is much of an issue about that. And I think if you are averse to honey or dates, then, I mean, it's not as if, you are not following the Prophet. So I think the main thing is that we follow the values of his prophethood and his mission. I think that's what will grant us success in this life and the hereafter, inshallah.
One final question from the men.
The conformity that you're mentioning about people who apply for jobs have to conform to a particular way and whatever, that's all to do with adhering to certain ways. So they don't want to have people come into the job which are not going to fit within it. So I can't see any problem at all with that. And you're saying that people will not get a job or whatever if they don't do. It's not an issue. I don't see that's an issue at all because it doesn't conflict with what normally one person does. That's a separate issue. The other thing is the management. You mentioned about managerial management and how the Prophet behaved, and you were trying to link it. I, for one, completely missed it because I didn't understand how you managed to link this bit. So maybe you could help, or maybe I just completely misunderstand. But where is that thing at all?
Yeah, Jazakallah. I'll tackle the second and then the first one. My first point was that whenever we talk about a holy figure, I feel, again, you can disagree with me, that I think we're not specific enough, personally, to look at his personality, to look at the trends which were happening in the society and connect it to our trends today. Now, I am making a bold connection, definitely. When I was researching the lecture, yes, and I was doing that purposefully because I was trying to situate the Prophet in a trend we are experiencing that affects our akhlaq and ethics. So for me, and especially amongst a lot of the research that has been done, managerialism is a trend which does affect the behavior of a person. Because you're right, of course, in a job description, we want you to do this and the skills are no problem. But when there's an imposition on soul and identity and religion and transcendence, which there is, in my view, whether you look at most institutions today, universities or otherwise, you can't express yourself, and this is the way. I would say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I would meditate. I would reflect for 10. And if you are honest about the employer, I'm going to meditate before I do teamwork. I'm going to meditate in a meeting. I'm going to meditate before that. This is what I would do. This is how I am as a person. But you won't be able to openly express that. And the second aspect comes with that is whether the work takes over one's life as such. And that is the performance absolute, whether all of your hours are drained within fulfilling corporate goals. So here, whether the person is able to express more personal feelings about who or she is and how that firm should, be more, for example, than just in a managed or commercial environment, then I think there is perhaps some conflict.
Where is the conflict? Meditate in your own time. Yeah. You're there to work 7.5 hours. Okay. Not there to meditate there. You do your job and you do it properly, and then you go and do all your meditation. What's it got to do with this managerial at all?
So what you just said is exactly the thing. You have just described the whole process perfectly. You said, do your job and then do it, right? Right, so this is what I'm questioning. Why should I do my job and then do it? Why? Why do I have to conform to that? Why do I have to think in a dichotomized way? I don't want to think like that.
Then why you wouldn't get a job then? Well, that's why you're saying that people are not going to get a job.
No, then what I'm saying is we have not appreciated the Prophet, because the Prophet transcended that system, because he was told, well, you behave in we will give you money, you keep quiet. That's what he was told. You do your thing. You preach. But we give you money, you keep quiet. Don't affect establishment. How did he accomplish what he wanted to accomplish? Because he changed people's values at the establishment level and at the grassroots level. For me, this is an imperfect system. That's the way I look at it. And I think we can, as human beings, always do better and better and better. This is the way I'm looking at it. Inshallah. Shukran. We learn from each other, inshallah. Well, I think the Prophet was a revolution. I'll say Salam Center is revolutionary. Okay, inshallah. Okay. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Shukran.